Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I know we're going to have a very robust conversation over the next 45 minutes about Saudi Arabia, the place of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East in this new world economy. The session tries to evaluate the progress in Saudi Arabia, but also trying to understand really where the world economy is going and how Saudi Arabia fits into this very, very complex puzzle. So I am delighted to have this stellar panel joining us. Mohammed Aljadaan, the Minister of Finance of Saudi Arabia, of course, Kristalina, Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, Abdullah, AlSwaha, Minister of Communication for Saudi Arabia, Faisal, Alibrahim, Minister of Economy and Planning of Saudi Arabia, and then Fink of BlackRock. So if we start, we'll start very macro and then start to go down to try and understand some of the things that we can fix and we can't fix. Larry, give me an overview of what the world economy looks like right now. We're going to hear from President Trump. Tariffs could be coming, they could not be coming. We're unclear exactly how fast he wants to act on what. Where do you see us in the next 6 months?
Well, let me just start off and say it's great to be here with my friends in the kingdom and Kristalina and friends in the audience, and of course you friends. The world's fine, so let's start there. Mm-hmm. I know media.
This is a good start.
It actually is fine. I mean, I know we have to have drama. And I know there's obviously imbalances here and there, and I know there's many social issues in the world that need to be addressed. But overall, the world's fine. Humanity's improving. Things are getting better overall. That being said, I mean, there are big shifts in how we think about the world, how we act in the world. And we're all trying to adapt to those shifts and all that stuff. But I just wanted to start off, you know, we're going to see these movements, but overall the world is going to be fine. And I truly believe that we still have one risk in the world, and that still is inflationary. And I know the IMF probably is in a different position than I am right now, but that is probably this one thing that I'm still fearful of. And a lot of it is just because I see more and more imbalances, and the imbalances can create that type of inflation. And that would be the greatest risk to the U.S. too, by the way. I mean, I'm highly bullish on the U.S. economy. Mm-hmm. If the Trump administration unlocks private capital, as they're talking about it, if they streamline permitting, hopefully Europe follows, please, Europe follows. The opportunities in the GCC are really fantastic. Mm-hmm. But the risks still remain that I could see elevated inflation that's not in everyone's viewfinder. And there is some probability, not 50%, but lower, that we could see the 10-year Treasury breaking 5%, which would disrupt a lot of things. So I'm not this euphoric optimist, but I'm pragmatically enthusiastic about where the world is, where we could go, the opportunity. You know, I wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal on Election Day about how we could, if we unlock private capital, we unlock private capital in the kingdom, and we unlock private capital in Europe and in the United States and other parts of the world, I think we're going to have an extraordinary 5 years in front of us. So we're going to have to wait and see how this all plays out. I'm looking forward to President Trump's conversation, but I'm not bearish by any imagination.
But Mr. Aljadaan, this is about, you know, resources and capital being deployed, finding different homes. How do you see these shifts actually changing in the next years?
Well, I think the world generally, I mean, Larry described it perfectly. I think opportunities are there, and the world is a lot better than what it was 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 100 years ago. But we also aspire to have a better world all the time. And if we are prepared to actually take a long-term view on things and make tough, difficult decisions, and be very committed on execution, I think we will get a lot better results than what we are seeing in a lot of places around the world. And since we are talking about Saudi Arabia, I can tell you, the fact that, the whole nation has been mobilized behind Saudi Vision 2030, the fact that there is a very clear communicated vision that not only the people, the business community, the government, all really driving to achieve a very clear target. And then you have a leadership that takes very long-term view, prepared to take tough decisions, and be consistent and driving that. I think that recipe would work not only in Saudi Arabia, that recipe would work in Europe, in Asia, and everywhere else. I think if you have this combination, you would unlock a lot of potential from the world.
I know the IMF always has good news for us, but also bad news. So let's maybe start with what worries you about the world and the region.
Look, I'm paid to worry about the well-being of the world. So
is Larry.
well, let me say this. It is remarkable how resilient the world economy has proven to be. We have been hit by COVID, then by energy and food price shock, then by interest rates jumping up. And look at us. Not only are standing on our feet, but the IMF upgraded global projections to 3.3% for this year, 3.3% next year. And when you look under the hood of these projections, there are countries that stand up. The United States very strongly stands up. It is a big driver of that positive picture. The Gulf, Saudi Arabia, stands up. There are parts of the world, however, that are in a much wobblier place. We see the European Union, although they are in a positive growth territory, 1.2% growth projections for the Eurozone, but confidence is somewhat weak. And what is particularly troubling when you want to see the whole world lifted up is where capital goes. Well, it goes to the United States. Much less to Europe, and pretty much stagnated when it comes down to investments in most of the emerging markets in developing economies. Why does capital go to the United States? Because of profitability. And if that picture remains with the US doing very well, yes, with positive spillover for the rest of the world, but that divergence story deepening, then there would be loss of opportunities, and there would be certainly problem bubbling up in terms of stability for the whole world. So what do we recommend in this environment? Well, the first thing we recommend is remember fundamentals. In many countries, the big problem is that they have not done their job as Saudi Arabia has done it to bring down debt levels and to create pro-growth environment. The amount of unnecessary obstacles to companies to grow in places where growth is slower is mind-boggling. And the second problem we see is that in many countries, the recognition that we are facing a technological transformation that may not have a match in history, and then preparing for AI, embracing AI systematically, that is not quite yet there. I want to finish with a word of praise for Mohammed Aljadaan. I don't know many ministers of finance that during the toughest times kept budget discipline despite everybody crying for money. And introducing VIT to make sure that you have sound position in Saudi Arabia. So to the audience, a finance minister who knows how to say no, which is a very important part of the job.
He says no all the time.
He deserves a round of applause to Mohammed.
He says no for the right reasons.
Yeah, so we'll talk about your worries about the economy overheating in just a second. But Minister Alibrahim, can you talk to us a little bit about, again, as there's this fight for capital deployment, and there is a worry that it's the U.S. first at the expense of everyone else. What does it mean for Saudi Arabia's ambitions?
So I think if you look at what we're witnessing recently, this economic torpor globally, and you look at the opportunities, we're all seeking engines of growth. The Saudi story is an example of how transformation, like Kristalina hinted, is an engine of growth. Despite the tepid 20s, as Kristalina described it in Riyadh, the kingdom has been able to fire up new engines of growth and keep moving forward. Our non-oil activities today represent 52% of our total real GDP for the first time. It's not an objective, it's not a goal, it's not a milestone, but it's something to keep in mind as a sign of things moving in the right direction. Non-oil growth this year is expected to close at 3.9%, next year 4.8%, and the year after 6.2%. All of this is telling us that the economic playbook that the kingdom is using is something that can be used by others as well. And it is going back to fundamentals of institutional capabilities, investing in human capital, and making tough decisions. And it can be used by many countries, as His Excellency Aljadaan said. It's about accelerating productivity, having a growth and bold, innovative growth mindset that embraces challenges, learns from failures, and continues to seek doing more. And at the heart of all of this is also enabling the private sector. So whatever challenges may come or changes may come, we're investing in a capability that will help us address how things change.
Minister AlSwaha, how do you see technology and AI changing the world economy, but also the kingdom?
I couldn't agree with what everybody has said. It's about the fundamentals. It's about saying no and yes for the right reasons. And it's about balancing that optimism with realism and focusing on where the growth is. If we take a step back as we're collaborating for the intelligent age, we have to reflect on how we have fared within the digital age. And we couldn't have done it without collaboration with all of you. When we laser focus on empowering people, we have to be very proud of the women empowerment story. And I see Lubna, Noura, Dima Yahya within the crowd here, jumping from 7% to 35% and delivering to the world Dr. Latifa Al-Abdelkarim, who's the only woman sits at the UN panel for AI advisory for the General Secretary, advising them on how we could shape a better future that is inclusive, innovative by AI. Pivoting to what the world right now is moving within the intelligent age, from generative AI to agentic AI and to physical AI. So within agentic AI, which is all about productivity and infusing that, we have Ghaida Tasan, who's collaborating with Aramco to make sure that we have one of the real use cases of how AI can deliver optimization, delivering $1 billion in optimization for Aramco. And last but not least, within physical AI, how Dr. Firas Khalil has leveraged robotics to tackle the shortage of heart surgeons, delivering the first heart transplant fully in robotics. So this is, in essence, an opportunity for us to leverage our capital, our patient capital, our captive market, our energy, and we spoke about this earlier, to really fuel a better future for humanity in collaboration with all of you.
So that's a positive scenario, but do you really feel that there's enough cooperation, right? And if you look at multilateralism, and this is also a question for you, Minister Aljadaan, there's a concern that we're going into something that will be much more bumpy, where actually countries won't want to collaborate together as much as before.
Well, let's appreciate that this is a general purpose technology. And as a general purpose technology, it's like preventing societies from the steam engine and from electricity, which we cannot afford that. I mean, you cannot deprive, suffocate, or dehydrate these economies because you will cause irreversible damage. And this is why the kingdom is committed on closing down the 3 new divides of the AI age. A compute divide. We need 63 gigawatts worth of energy. This is equivalent to what India needs, the most populous nation. And energy leads to heat, leads to water, and we spoke about this earlier as well, as much energy and water that you need as well in the United States. We need to make sure that these algorithms address hallucination, disinformation, and all of these aspects. And we have Dr. Amr Awadallah and Dr. Ihsan al-Haq, who recently received the US Presidential Award for early in career work on delivering algorithms that feed humanity to make sure that we deliver things. So I couldn't agree with you more. Today, in the digital age, we used to talk about the digital divide. In the AI divide, it's becoming a dignity divide, where we need like-minded nations, a coalition of thought leaders coming together and making sure that this general purpose technology has to proliferate to make sure that it's inclusive, innovative, and impactful.
Kristalina?
We do live through times of massive transformation, including in how the world economy functions and how collaboration among nations takes place. What I observe from where I sit is, one, a much bigger role for countries that do have strong fundamentals and think of collaboration with other nations in regional context or around the supply chain or around an objective, a mission for the betterment of the world. What I see, for example, with the Gulf Cooperation Council, what I see there is a stepped up engagement, much more substantive discussion on key policy issues, and much more thoughtful engagement with the rest of the world. I see this in ASEAN. In other words, if there is some step back from global cooperation in the traditional way, there is step forward in cooperation, collaboration based on interest, based on sometimes geography. And I do believe that this is a reflection of the necessity for the world to collaborate. You can't get out of it. My second point is for how impressive Saudi Arabia has been in stepping forward in a leadership role as one of the countries that see themselves in this change in the world, moving to multipolar, whatever we want to call it, as one of the pillars of that new form of cooperation. Mohammed Aljadaan chairs the IMFC, the IMF governing body. I have seen in many occasions Saudi Arabia very thoughtfully stepping forward to find that constructive tone of engagement. And my plea is for us to keep an eye of that trend of engagement that is not anymore based on the traditional UN General Assembly, the traditional multilateral structures. And I take it for us at the fund to mean more focus on these emerging centers of cooperation. We have at the IMF only one systemic instrument of regional engagement. This is so-called Article 4 consultation for the Eurozone. And I believe that we need to engage more in that format because this is the world we are now living in.
I think it's a myth that multilateralism is dead. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is evolving, it's changing.
Yep.
But world trade is still growing. There is more opportunities than ever. Mm-hmm. But they're evolving and they're changing. And you're seeing regional changes that are going on. When you think about the growth of India and the opportunity there, and you balance out India and China and Southeast Asia, there's an opportunity. You know, my 20-plus years of visiting the kingdom and the region and seeing the transformation and the opportunities. Let me also say the optimism.
Yes. Especially of the young people and the women. I mean, it's incredible.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But but even in parts of South America, which in many cases disappoints, but there are really pockets of opportunity too. And so yes, the United States as a percent of GDP has grown dramatically versus the world. As Kristalina said, it does feed the world in different ways. President Trump is going to try to find some realignment, but we're all going to navigate. We'll all find the best ways. That's what I want to. When I start off and say the world's fine, because there's just too much pessimism. And
Pessimism or realism?
no, it's pessimism. It's not realism. Yes, things are changing, and most people don't like change, and things are evolving, and the fear of AI, but the opportunity in AI. I mean, I look at this as something that there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. That being said, we can't deny that there is a need for more of a flattening. There's a need for making sure that we're trying to lift the whole world at the same time. But it is a myth that's saying the world hasn't been lifted over the last 25 years. The world has been lifted. Capitalism works, by the way. It truly, truly works. And there's a lot of pessimism in parts of the anti-capitalist feeling, especially here in Davos, but it works, and some of the optimism that I see in the kingdom and I see in the region is that optimism that historically the government umbrella over the economy was very large. That umbrella is shrinking. There's young startups growing everywhere. Entrepreneurialism is alive throughout the region. There's a lot to be optimistic about, and it's just being smothered by some segments of society.
Let me go to the man that sometimes has to say no, Minister Aljadaan. So you have spoken about the need to prevent the economy from overheating, which you said, look, the government will handle. You could face extra tariffs from the Trump administration. You could face an energy policy that could change from the Trump administration. And then you've gotten closer to China. What do you worry about most?
Few things I think needs to be said very clearly. I think the whole idea of Saudi Vision 2030 is actually to deal with these shocks, to make the economy more resilient, to totally unlock this relationship between oil and oil volatility and the economy. Decoupling is happening, incredibly happening. And we are very proud of it, but we are not complacent. We are continuing and pushing through. And regardless of what happens around the world, we believe that we have the resilience to actually deal with shocks. And we have. Over the last 6 years, we've been through considerable shocks, and we managed actually to maneuver and continue growing. In relation to the US, and I would make this actually very clear, I think we said this several times before, for the past 8 decades, Saudi Arabia, and history is there, I mean, it's not secret, have managed to deal with whoever is residing in the White House, Republican, Democrat, and enjoyed actually a very strategic economic and trade relationship and other factors, including diplomatic security. And I think Trump is no exception. There is a win-win situation for both nations. We need each other, and as long as there is a win-win deal, we will continue. And I think that is going to continue now and in the foreseeable future.
Minister Alibrahim, when you talk about this huge transformation and diversification with investors, what do they ask you the most?
Good question. So right now, maybe just to emphasize some signs of the power of diversification. A decision to start 4 sectors, tourism, entertainment, culture, and sports, a few years ago, even before COVID, not even the decision yet, and we saw a shift in inbound versus outbound tourism spend towards the kingdoms. Then COVID happened, and then it came back. And that's even before making let's say, all the necessary regulatory changes and all the announcements so there is power of diversification that we're witnessing in our GDP numbers, which is not everything, but we're seeing it. Our numbers wouldn't have been this strong if it weren't for these strong decisions, bold decisions. So in the past, I think the first momentum on the Vision 2030, the first wave came from clear, simple to identify decisions that required boldness and courage and leadership. And these were made, and the investments behind them, investments in terms of effort, not just spend and whatnot, led to what we're seeing today. The next wave will require answering some more complex questions that we will confident to arrive at. But the most consistent thing across these two waves and whatever comes later is the importance of enabling the private sector. We want our private sector to be representing 65% of our GDP. Creating this space for the private sector to co-create the transformation journey, co-develop opportunities, and later develop the opportunities and lead in them is important for us to see that shift. This is about institutional capability, it's about institutional clarity, policy predictability, and many other things. So it's important for us to even get some of these trade questions finalized, some of these open competition questions finalized, some of the challenges facing innovation-driven entrepreneurship addressed, so we can see more entrants that come in and shape up and compose the private sector that we need, that we want to lead the economic growth story. And it's also about listening to the private sector. Most of us are here, most of our time, the ministers in Davos, 9 ministers, 20 meetings, almost bilateral meetings, most of them are with the private sector. Back home, most of the ministers work not 9-to-5 jobs and their teams, they work 14, 16-hour jobs, and most of the time they are responding to the private sector or talk to it's part of their DNA, it's part of our blueprint to get there, but also we'll get in trouble if we don't respond to them and they escalate.
That's always a good incentive. Minister?
5 years ago, Larry gave us some feedback. He said, where's your cloud players? Where's your hyperscalers? So what we have done, we introduced a cloud-first policy. We fixed the tariffs to make sure it's strategic. Fast forward, $10.6 billion have been invested into cloud. Amazon, $5.3 billion, Microsoft, $2.6, Google, $1.5, the rest. For the AI age, we have received also other feedback in closed sessions here in Davos. It was myself, His Excellency Aljadaan, and Alibrahim, we were there. They were talking about the need for data sovereignty, and you talked about this earlier in your panel today. They were talking about data free flow. So right now we took some of our pieces of legislation, like the Personal Data Protection Act, like the Freedom of Information Act. We went back to the drawing board and we revamped these legislation. And as a result of that, we are in dialogues right now to take the 300 of megawatts we have built for the digital age all the way to a gigawatts plus, not only to serve the kingdom and to the region. And kudos to Alphabet for making the first bet, announcing it in last FII.
Minister, yes.
I want to give an example that really impressed me, and it is strategic thinking about diversifying the economy in the area of tourism. I went to visit Abdullah. For those who don't know Saudi Arabia, if you're interested in cultural and historic heritage, go there. What impressed me was not just that you have a premier, rich, historically rich location, but how much was done to bring the private sector to offer diverse experience. There is a conference center. Actually, we will be there for a global conference that is so impressive, and it is booked. Why? Because of that thinking ahead, that you need attraction for people to come, you need good environment for them to stay, and you need to create repeat arrivals. And that is all. I honestly, when I went, I didn't know what to expect, and I came out and I thought, great that we decided to open the regional office in Riyadh, because we can create this repeat experience for policymakers on that basis. So it is very real. You know, when people talk about transforming countries, they can genuinely look at Saudi Arabia as a good example of transformation.
I spoke at this panel for a few times, and as I was preparing for this panel, thinking about the change over the last 5 years, I mean, my thoughts are different than my conversation that I had even 5 years ago. And for those who have not been to the kingdom, you should see the trend. You would be overwhelmingly surprised. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to enlighten more of our private investors who we're working with alongside with BlackRock to see the opportunity to invest. And I think there's going to be a very great opportunity for more investors to be focusing on the opportunities within the kingdom, within the region. And as I said, this is a growth area. And, you know, the one thing that as investors that we historically have feared when we invested not in the most safe parts of the world, we always worried about rule of law. And we've seen in some places where it hasn't been consistent. I could tell you from our experiences as investors, I could tell you experiences by being there, this is one thing that I think is truly preserved within the kingdom, the rule of law. And as investors, as more investors understand that more capital will be coming into the kingdom and throughout the region. And I would also say as a neighborhood gets safer, more and more tourists are going to be coming and more opportunities. And as I look at the neighborhood, it's a pretty fine neighborhood.
And we'll talk about geopolitics in a second, but Mr. Aljadaan, I want to also ask you about, because I know we have some very sophisticated investors that are also watching. What's your expectations for this year in terms of FDI? Are you going to sell more stakes in companies? And actually, what are the projects that you're expecting to tweak when it comes to Vision 2030?
First of all, I think 25 is going to be a positive year, despite all the noise that you hear globally. I think we are focused, and as His Excellency said, we are expecting very healthy growth in the non-oil GDP. We have moved for the last few years from the one-year budget, the three-year budget, to now actually a longer-term fiscal planning. And we know actually what is our fiscal space and what we are going to spend, what our priorities are. But at the same time, I've said this, I repeat it, we don't have egos. We are willing to change depending on circumstances, and we will continue to do that. We will prioritize what matters. We will prioritize based on circumstances that could take place around the world. But we are very confident that our key North Star is what is driving us. And you know, the tools can change, the means can change. It's really that North Star that we are looking forward to.
Since we are paid to identify risks, I can tell you that a year ago, one thing that we were concerned about in Saudi Arabia is the country biting more than it can chew in terms of large-scale investment projects. Mm-hmm. And then, as we just heard, we realized that the kingdom is going to course correct as necessary. There would be no sticking to the fiscal commitment if there is a need to change. And I can say the same we see in terms of price of oil. Full recognition that price of oil continues to be a variable for Saudi Arabia that needs to be monitored. And openness, there is no throwing dust in your eyes, and that is remarkable.
Yes?
So I just want to add on, when Vision 2030 started, we didn't imagine that we would be hosting the world twice in 4 years, an Expo in 2030, and so naturally you have to reprioritize, adjust. And I think it's a balance between the clarity that long-term planning and today fiscal planning 7 years onwards gives, but also maintaining the muscle of agility to respond to changes.
I was going to ask you, Minister, actually, what surprised you the most about resilience in the Saudi economy over the last 3 to 4 years?
I think if you look at COVID specifically, we probably mentioned this before, the institutional capabilities that were just the seeds were planted in the beginning of Vision 2030, how it performed in COVID-19 for a year plus, very seamlessly, whether it was the His Royal Highness and supported by His Excellency's decision to kind of plug in the infrastructure needed for virtual meetings, like as if he knew about COVID-19 ahead of time, but it worked seamlessly. Teams worked tireless sleepless nights almost. And I want to actually use this maybe to double down on what Kristalina said. Within the government, within Saudi, the culture between ministers, and His Excellency mentioned this in public before, shifted. People today are comfortable critiquing each other because we're all seeking doing things better, and people accept it. And I wonder, because of what you said, if governments also did that, not just through multilateral platforms or bilaterally, but very collegially and very openly and friendly, because we're seeking improving our performance, maybe we'd be in a different
Can I just add to that? Yeah. I mean, I've never seen a government that is more collaborative. And they actually like each other. It's really fun to be around. And I mean that. I mean, I get to travel around a lot, talk to a lot of people. It is one of those pleasures of my career of having dinners with many of the ministers, and the collaborativeness, the team spirit. They all have the same positive mission, and they believe to the bottom of their soul in their mission. And that elevates an economy.
I couldn't agree more. It's about the fundamentals, consistency, and having that drive and passion that drives progress. We've been consistent. Government should be in the business of no business. We've heard you loud and clear. We need to double down on regulation, from red tape to red carpet, infrastructure, and talent. How have we done in the past 5 years? According to the UN, we're #1 in digital skills. We've jumped from 150,000 tech force to 381,000. If you put us in the EU zone, we'll be the 5th largest tech force in Europe. We're actually right now at par with the Silicon Valley. This is, mind you, in 5 to 7 years, and hence His Royal Highness have coined the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as the most successful reform story of the 21st century. Let's talk about other fundamentals. Infrastructure. You spoke about COVID and how we handled it. We were ranked #2 by the UN in terms of readiness and digital competitiveness. And the European Center for Digital Competitiveness ranked us #1 and #2 consecutively post-COVID. Let's talk about the AI age. We're doubling down on the same thing. Regulation. His Excellency, with support of His Royal Highness, talked about the reform, the data embassy, and so forth. Talent. We need right now to transform that 381,000 tech force into data scientists, engineers, to fuel the next wave of entrepreneurship.
Minister, what do you wish you'd do better?
A few things. One is prioritization. And His Excellency spoke about this in a number of sessions. I believe two things: prioritization and doing a better job of solving for what I call perspective versus perception. One thing that we don't do well is enough communication to appreciate that the kingdom is undergoing a huge transformation within a clear investment thesis: oil-based economy, innovation-based economy. And there are 3 levers. You have low-end disruption, so naturally you will see tourism and unlock 130 million tourists coming into place. Sustaining innovation, smart cities, quality of life, and new market disruption. And these moonshots, similar to the Apollo mission, to the other missions, we need to be patient, and it's multi-decade.
Minister, in terms of geopolitics, I mean, this was a huge setback, actually, just when Saudi Arabia was trying to normalize relationship with Israel. How do you see this playing out, and how much does it weigh on investors' mind?
2 things. One is we are not in a rush, really, to normalize. There are prerequisites, and if these prerequisites takes place, then yes, we are. We are after peace, and I think peace brings prosperity, no matter who the region is. But we are also not going to ignore the fact that Palestinian people deserve a better future, and we need to make sure that we have an irrevocable path towards a 2-state solution. And if that happens, absolutely.
Does that bring with that a lot more investment, or is it one of the biggest questions
I think it will bring this region and any other region. Peace will bring prosperity. And I've said this repeatedly, and I think whether it is in this region or somewhere else, actually peace and prosperity are indispensable. You cannot separate the two.
Right.
Two nations in a war will not have peace and prosperity if one of them doesn't. Okay, so we are working with our partners and the region and beyond to make sure that we deliver that. And we are patient, but also we want to push and we want the international community to push.
Larry?
What's the question for me?
The question is that as an investor and you look at the Middle East, I mean, are there questions because of geopolitics and you don't really know what happens next? And
Yeah,
you
I mean, first of all,
lasting peace.
none of this is our money. $11.6 trillion we're investing on behalf of clients, and we have views and we try to direct clients' money, but mostly clients direct where their money wants to go. We're seeing more and more money being directed into the whole GCC region, into the kingdom. And we do have money invested in Israel, and we have money invested in all the areas. I mean, the reality is, as the minister spoke, peace will bring much more investment. We all know that. That is just an outright fact. Peace would bring more tourism, and obviously, peace is going to bring a lot more prosperity and smiles. But the reality is more money is coming into the region than ever before. And the opportunity is just as great today as any time in my financial life.
If I may, I think just to clarify also, it is very critically important that we do not look at the Middle East and the MENA region as one region.
Yes.
I mean, it's actually almost three regions. You have the GCC, largely.
That's right.
That are prospering, they're reforming, taking the right decisions and making the right decisions and moving ahead. You have the middle-income countries who are struggling but are trying to do the right things, and we are trying to support them, and you have the fragile states. So, but GCC alone is a bright spot that is now, actually, if you ask around Davos, they don't look at it as the Middle East with all the trouble around it. They look at GCC as actually...
And I would say that as an investor, that's exactly how investors are looking at it. They look at the GCC as a singular region, and we should all be talking about that. We should not be denying the other issues that are being around, but if you're thinking about where can you attract, good long-term returns with opportunities, the GCC region is one of those growth areas with a lot of opportunities, and the kingdom is a major component. It's a leading country in the region.
I'd say also on the GCC countries, two things. All GCC countries today are thinking and acting in a structured long-term fashion with a long view, and everyone is prioritizing what's best for the people. And it's long-term, and I feel it's only getting started. Vision 2030 is on track, gaining momentum, but the job is not done. We're still in the middle of a long-term restructuring of our economy that has an impact on the rest of the region, and I think is giving hope to the rest of the region, as we see.
If you look at the global economy, $10-ish trillion, digital economy, $16 trillion. Look at the GCC. We should be easily 6 to 7% points of that, whether you're talking digital economy or overall economy. And hence, everything is upside. Whatever you do, the few unlocks that we could do, regulatory with consistency, infrastructure and talent, is paying dividends. We've grown just as a proxy in the past 7 years with 7 unicorns and 7 more to come in the pipeline.
Kristalina?
I see for GCC very sound future because of the commonality of views. Countries are not the same, but the direction is the same. I see very important role for GCC countries to stabilize the rest of the region, and there is massive engagement when I think about Egypt. I cannot think about Egypt without the role that the Saudis, the Emirates are playing. Lebanon is now finally having a president and prime minister that we can work with. I can tell you I count on that same engagement. And what I also see is that maturity of judgment, that finding partners to work in the most difficult places really matters. We haven't mentioned that, but during COVID, Saudi Arabia hosted the G20. They had to switch from in-person to online. And during COVID, Saudi Arabia took the lead on debt service suspension with the fund and the bank on the common framework. And that kind of initiative for stability and prosperity that goes in the direction of trouble, that trouble still exists. You were asking what more we want. From where I sit, I really enjoy having more of that.
We have to wrap up, but Minister, I just want to give you a final word. It feels like 2025 will be pivotal, but Saudi Arabia is ready. Is that how you would describe it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we count on our people. I think we have an incredible, and I'm not saying it to really sell, I really believe it. I am very proud of our youth. I'm very proud of how the government works. I'm very proud of how dedicated the private sector, and I think that's what would make the change. And we have a leadership who are committed, working harder than what we are working, as His Excellency Faisal said. And we have no excuse.
Thank you so much for a great panel. Thank you.